On to the main topic this evening, pilgrimage in a pandemic. And leading us through this very personal conversation is the Bishop of Edinburgh, the Right Reverend Dr. John Arms, and his guest, the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson from the United Church of Christ, Associate General Minister. So welcome to you all, welcome to our audience, and thank you so much for joining us, John and Karen Georgia. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Helen, and welcome to everyone. Although I can't see you, I hope you will enjoy being part of this conversation and will feel able to contribute, as Helen suggests, through the question and answer facility. Perhaps a quick word as to where this theme came from. When we were originally thinking about what we might present at the Just Festival, I wanted to have a conversation about pilgrimage in its broadest sense, because not least because in the Episcopal Church next year, we were going to have a year of pilgrimage. That's now changed to a season of pilgrimage, but it will still be happening. Then, of course, lockdown came, and we realised that the Just Festival wouldn't be able to function in quite the way it normally does. But nevertheless, this theme of pilgrimage still seemed to me to be relevant, because, not least because we have all of us globally been through a traumatic experience, and are still going through it in many ways, of a pandemic. And therefore, that kind of significant experience, which throws in front of us questions about meaning of life and faith and God and all sorts of questions like that, inevitably has this element of, well, where does God feature in this journey? And if pilgrimage is about a journey with God, or a journey into God, or a journey reflecting on God, then that seems to me to be a really, very relevant question to consider at the moment. And therefore, it's very good to have, as part of this conversation today, and indeed our main conversation partner, Karen Georgia Thompson, who has lived through this experience in a particular way. And it will be very interesting to hear not only what her experience has been, but her reflections on that as herself a Christian minister, a preacher, a teacher, a poet, and as Helen has said, Associate General Minister, the wider church ministries and operations, and co-executive for global ministries in the United Church of Christ, which is a mouthful. And perhaps she'll touch on that in a minute. But I suppose one of the advantages of being able to do a webinar this year, rather than a live conversation, is that we can get really interesting people from other parts of the world who perhaps wouldn't otherwise be able to be with us. And Karen Georgia is just such a person. Karen Georgia, I've hinted at some of the personal experiences you've had during these months of pandemic. I don't want to trespass on that. I would like you to tell us more about that. So perhaps you could begin by telling us something of your story over these last few months.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Helen and Grant, for your collegiality thus far, and thanks Just Festival for the invitation to be present in this way. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story and a little bit about myself in that as I go. So I'll start with the fact that, certainly here in the US, as we prepared for pandemic, as I'm one of the elected officers of the United Church of Christ, our first priority was ensuring that our staff was going to be safe, and ensuring that our staff was deployed and had what they needed to work from home. That was a priority for me towards the end of March. And so we deployed our staff on March 20th. That was my last day in the office. I had packed up the things that I thought I needed for a temporary work from home situation, and left the office and came home. On my way home, I had a conversation with my sister, and I'll give her a shout out because she's joined the conversation for today. And I talked with her, and she told me that our father was not doing well. He hadn't really gotten out of bed for a couple of days, which was very unusual for him. He was 85. And when I came home a couple of hours afterwards, I called again to check to see how he was doing. This is the age of WhatsApp and all kinds of technologies. And so I asked her to put him on WhatsApp video and attempted to talk with him. And we decided that he needed to go to the hospital. The ambulance arrived about 6 o'clock, picked him up after having to resuscitate his heart twice. And at 9:30 that night, I got in my car and started the 8-hour drive to New York City. I live in Ohio, so I drove through the night, stopped along the way, and picked up one of my sisters and made it into New York by 6 a.m. on the 21st of March. When I got to the hospital, he had already passed. We had no idea. He was somebody who was healthy. He worked out pretty regularly. He was very active. And so it was incredibly sudden. While I was driving, I was making decisions as his health proxy about things like whether or not he should be intubated. So the drive through the night was not one that was in silence, except it was pretty eerie because at that point, we were in lockdown. There were no cars on the highways. All the service areas were shut down. So really, there was no place to stop for 8 hours of this drive. So he passed, and we had no idea what his cause of death was. Nobody told us anything different. His organs had just started shutting down. And then on Tuesday, they called us to say that he had died of COVID. We didn't know what to make of it, didn't know what to do, but by Wednesday, I was sick, my sister was sick. My nephew, who lives downstairs from my sister, was also sick. And so there were 3 of us sick in the house with COVID-19, trying to figure out what to do about our father who had passed, because we could not get his body from the hospital. This happened in New York City. The funeral homes were stressed out. It took them days to pick up his body. It took what normally would be a few days to plan a funeral turned into a 2-week long process, which didn't really make any difference to us because we were all sick. And when I say we were sick, we couldn't get out the bed. We collectively had lost our sense of smell, our sense of taste. We weren't eating. And there were days when I couldn't get out the bed. My sister couldn't get out the bed. The body aches, the pains. None of us saw a doctor. So we were basically taking Tylenol every 4 to 6 hours en masse for the pains and the fever, and just trying to figure out how to live in a moment that we didn't understand, and had very little frameworks for living through. Among the first days that we were ill, one of our neighbors, one of my sister's neighbors, called and said she was going to the grocery store and asked if we needed anything. So my sister left the money in the mailbox with a list. And so the neighbor went to the grocery store, got us groceries, left them on the doorstep, and we went downstairs and picked them up. My brother picked up groceries for us. people, would call and ask us what we need. And so a part of our survival is actually rooted in generosity, right? Generosity of strangers and family and friends who extended themselves and found ways to take care of us when, in essence, we couldn't take care of ourselves and couldn't really expose other people, because if there was one thing that we knew for sure and that my sister and I were very committed to, it was that we were not gonna expose other people to us. And so even when we left the hospital, we didn't know what my father had died from. We immediately started quarantining ourselves. So I'll pause there because that was really just the beginning. The first few days really of what has turned out to be a month's long journey. So it started with what was quite evident in terms of a set of symptoms: the fever, the aches and pains, all the other things, the lethargy, just all of those things. And then it morphed into what I would call something else, because there's a lot of it that is just hard to name and hard to identify. I think the other piece in the midst of being ill was then what happened with my father. So when he died, he was alone because my brother and my sister, who had been at the hospital, had gone home. We're in a pandemic. You don't really hang around in a hospital. So they had gone home. So he died alone. I was able to see him. And when my half sister Patrice and I got to New York, my sister Andrine and my brother Kevin met us at the hospital. And I went in and I was able to, I prayed over his body, and we had prayer at his bedside. That's what you do when you're clergy and you show up, right? Little did we know that moment in his hospital room really ended up being his last rites, because after the funeral home was able to get his body, it took more days to figure out arrangements. New York City was on lockdown. They told us we could have 10 people at the funeral. I was gonna perform the service, and we just decided we would just do something at the graveside, and it was just gonna be me, my sister, and my brother. We were gonna try to include the rest of the family, WhatsApp, just by video as best as we could. When we arrived at the cemetery, they told us that we couldn't get out the car, that they would not take care of the body unless we stayed in the car. And so my question to the funeral, I said, well, he hasn't had last rites. And they said, well, it doesn't really matter. They could not take the casket out of the vehicle. The workers at the cemetery had to do that, and they were not going to come if we were out of the car. And so we basically just walked over to the hearse. We just looked at the coffin, got back in the car, and sat in the car. And then they came. So there's a video that it's about 4 minutes, but kind of is the experience that we had of this moment of trying to inter our father at the cemetery.
Thank you. So we'll ask Grant to bring up that video now.
Here we are again, that old familiar place, where the wind will blow. No one ever knows the time or space. Don't cry for me, don't shed a tear. The time I shared with you will always be. And when I'm gone, still carry on. Don't cry for me. No one is to blame, Lord. My death was meant to be. Don't carry guilt or shame. The reason why I came, soon you'll see. Don't cry for me. Don't shed a tear. The time I've shared with you will always be. And when I'm gone, please carry on. Don't cry for me. Don't cry when life is not the joy it should be. With life comes pain. Soon time will end its course appointed. Then you will be rewarded, and all the world will see. Don't cry for me. Don't shed a tear. The time I shared with you will always be. And when I'm gone, life still carries on. Don't cry for me. We'll always be. Don't cry
Thank you, Karen Georgia. I mean, obviously we can all see that that was a very emotional experience for you just watching that again. and I suppose it's a bittersweet experience that not just you, but so many people across the world have been through over these last few months. And I suppose at first we thought, well, we won't be able to have a large ceremony now for this dearly loved person, but the time will come in a few weeks when we can have some sort of memorial service. And then as the process has gone on, we've realized that perhaps even that, well, it may not be timely anymore. So do you have any reflections on that? And yourself as a Christian minister, but also as someone who has this very real question in her own mind, you know, what are you going to do now to celebrate the life of your father, to remember him, not just as a family, but all the other people who would want to remember him and honor him, who knew him in his life? What ideas are you coming up with for this?
So it has been very hard, because at first we thought we would have that memorial service a few months later. Then it became evident that that was not going to happen. The video, by the way, was done by my brother, who just, I guess out of some impulse, just started filming as we went. And now it's really the only memory that we have left of this particular moment. We were able, at the end of, towards the end of May, we did have a memorial service for him. We invited family and close friends. It was important for me and for my siblings that we have a moment where folks could have some closure and have the ability to offer expressions of concern. And so by Zoom, I put together a memorial service for him that was actually attended by family really across the world, from Canada, from Jamaica, which is where we're from. And we were able to share the recording as well. We hope that at some point we might be able to gather as family and friends, those who loved him, to celebrate his life in some way that's in person. But right now we cannot see evidence of when that time might be. And so for right now, it's really just been that we had the opportunity to do the service.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Well, just as we've been speaking here, there's a message from, I think, probably a friend of yours, Joyce Myers-Brown from Atlanta, Georgia, saying such a moving video and story. God bless you and your family, dear Karen Georgia. And then from Robert Ray, my sincerest condolences to you and your family on your sad loss. Can I ask, I'd like to move on in a moment to kind of quite deep spiritual questions, I suppose, but how are you now physically? Because you said you had COVID. You hinted that there were still ongoing repercussions of that. How are you?
Today I am okay. And I've really moved into the realm of taking this one day at a time. A few weeks ago, I had to call my doctor. I was having things like the brain fog kept going for months. I'm moving into a place where I have more clarity. So for a long time, I could not sustain the concentration, for example, to read the chapter in a book. The fatigue was something that lingered for a significant time. And so really right now, I work a modified work week as best I can. Sometimes I cannot, but a modified work week because my energy is not where it's supposed to be. I went through a period where I was having body aches and pains, significant headaches. In fact, they sent me to get a COVID test because they thought I was experiencing COVID again, which made me weep because I just could not. So I went and I had a COVID test. I've been tested for COVID antibodies to show that I did have, which shows that I did have COVID. The second time I was not positive. But my doctor told me, she said, well, it's going to take a while on recovery. They're seeing months of, people taking months. My hair started falling out, which I guess is a result of the stress associated with. And so I basically cut all my hair off to accommodate that. I think I'm looking okay with the new haircut. So that's okay. And it will grow back. And my sister has also had body aches and pains. Her fingernails became really discolored, which we think is a result of lack of oxygen while she was sick. And the list just kind of goes on and on. So we just continue to take care of ourselves. I am back at home. I was in New York for almost 10 weeks because the 8-hour drive that I took into New York, I did not have the capacity to drive back home. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't stay awake. I didn't have the energy. And so I ended up in New York for 10 weeks. So I've been back home since the end of May. And so, like I said, just taking care of myself, but really it's one day at a time. And I just continue to just let people know it's a hard recovery. So the active state is one thing. The body aches, the fever, the pains, not being able to smell, all of that stuff is one phase. And then you go into this other stage of recovery, which is more ambiguous because you start to second guess yourself because none of it makes any sense. And there's no book to read and there's no place to go. You're basically starting to work on anecdotal evidence to figure out what's wrong. There's no medicine, there's no vaccine. So just taking care of myself and and isolating. So that's important to me. To continue to as best as possible to kind of stay away from crowds and things like that because I cannot risk that again. It was just hard. It's hard.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. Again, I think that probably rings true to a lot of people's experience and rather gives the lie to the idea that COVID happens and you get over it or you don't. The lasting consequences, both personal for individuals and therefore for our health services, are going to be huge, I think. So I hope and pray that those of you who have had this will have antibodies that will make you immune, because that would be a terrible thing to discover that the immunity only lasted for a short time. I suppose it's an experience for everyone that's made us ask hard questions of ourselves. But those of us who are practical theologians, people of faith, I suppose have been forced to ask hard questions of God. And where is God to be found in all this? Where's God to be found in your experience? And what are the hard questions about God you might like to share with us now?
So, our COVID experience started at the end of March, and mine ran through over Easter. So in one of those ironies that life gives you, my fever broke on Maundy Thursday. And so that first moment of wellness for me came on Good Friday, and on Saturday, and by Sunday morning, I found myself. I wrote a reflection which I called "No Alleluias," because I found myself in experiencing sitting outside the tomb that that for me was evident of the resurrected Christ. The tomb was empty, but I didn't experience it as an emptiness, because for me the tomb in that moment was full of all these lives that were being taken in this period. And I knew also that my father was in that tomb. And so it was hard for me to celebrate Easter. And instead I sat and I wrote. And I think it wasn't so much about where is God in the midst of suffering. It was some of the questions about, why this moment, and why these people. And I had come out on the other side, and my life had been spared. The weeks that, and it was weeks, the weeks during which I was sick, there were nights when I closed my eyes and I thought for sure that I was gonna die. And so there's this kind of near-death experience. And so the thing that kept coming to me was Psalm 23, verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And that really was something that I repeated over and over again. This place of knowing that even though I was as sick as I was, I knew that God was present with me. So it wasn't so much about questioning the why of it. It was the knowledge that God was present. And in the end, it was for me a renewed sense of calling, because I really felt, and I still do, that that my life was spared to continue to answer this calling, but also to ask of the church, as a leader in the church, as an elected officer of our denomination. I'm still asking the question, and where is the church present in this moment? How do we show up? What is it that we have to offer when people are socially isolated, are elderly, are vulnerable and at risk? How do we show up when we can't be physically present? What do we have to give in this moment? I had a conversation with one of our pastors in New York City, who talked about the fact that so many in her congregation were ill or were dying. The stress that's present on our clergy, the stress that's present in our communities. What does this mean? The stress being in New York City, the PTSD is real, the post-traumatic stress disorder. It got to the point where when we would hear sirens on the block where we were, because I was staying with my sister at my parents' house, when we would hear sirens, we would just think like, who died? Like, who is it now? So the sirens became triggering. You know, so how are we attending and providing pastoral care in this moment when sometimes people don't even know what it is that they need? They don't know what to ask for. We've moved into this virtual world where our Sunday mornings are on Zoom. But what does Monday through Saturday look like in this space that we now occupy? So these are some of the questions that I was asking of myself. You know, we've moved into a Zoom environment. You know, what happens when people can't funeralize their dead? You know, how do we memorialize in communities, in spaces? And I think also it really brought to me the question about how do we talk about death and dying? Right? So we can't have funerals. So how do we talk about death? How do we communicate that moment? How, what do we have to share? So I came out with this host of questions. And from a personal standpoint, for me, it was, what does it mean to walk through the valley? What does it mean to hold this moment? So in addition to writing No Alleluias, which came on Easter Sunday morning, I also wrote this poem called The Valley. So I'm gonna read The Valley. If anyone wants a copy of the poem, it's I've made it available to Just Festival for sharing. You can use it as long as there are permissions. But we thought I would just go ahead and read it and not scroll it on the screen. So if you could just hear these words from The Valley. A curious juxtaposition this, numbers climbing, people dying, in the whispered sacredness of a week of the holy, standing at the foot of occupied crosses, the stench of death wafting by. Memories of years past, hats made ready, pastels on display, eggs painted and polished, hidden in grass, piled high in baskets with peeps and chocolate rabbits, celebrating spring and new life. Where are your tears? Stop by the mourning bench. Come, sit in the valley. Come, sit with the shadow of death. Come, sit with the pain and brokenness. Come, sit in the wetness of your tears. Come, sit and weep on the way to the tomb. Distant recollections these as we trudge through the valley, marching through the shadows of death. We search for the empty tomb, looking for signs that we live, confronting the truth of sickness named virus, moving unseen among us. We watch news conferences. We wait with bated breath, curious to know of outcomes and fatalities, waiting for signs of the resurrection to be evidenced among us. Why do we have no tears? Why not stop at the mourning bench? Come, sit in the valley. Come sit with the shadow of death. Come sit with your pain and your brokenness. Come sit in the wetness of your tears on the way to the tomb. The silence of death lingers, broken as a knell resounds, interrupting the stillness of possibility as sirens wail, the hope of new life longed for. In the absence of sound, we wait. The lilies are late this year. The cold of winter delays our spring, the dampness of death and sickness, a pall covering Sunday morning sunrise, shrouding Easter with pallid surprise. Where is God in the midst of death and suffering? Where is the empty tomb promised this resurrection morning? Grief demands our tears. Mourning needs no fancy seat. Come, walk through the valley. Come, live with this shadow of death. Come, wrestle with the pain and brokenness. Come, drown in the wetness of your tears outside the empty tomb.
Thank you. It's a very powerful poem, particularly coming from your experience. And the idea that grief demands our tears, and the encouragement to walk through the valley and to sit with the experience, I think is so important. And I suppose it's our initial reactions to this experience we've gone through will be summoned up by poetry, much better than by long tomes of theology. And I think one of the things that we learned in this country, at least in my experience in this diocese, is that whilst as clergy, we've perhaps in a sense felt that we've disappeared, in another sense, we have been all the busier because we have been trying just to live with people through a very difficult experience, which we're sharing with them in a very real sense. And to rush too quickly to get explanations or answers, I think would mean that we would be missing out on that important journey through the valley of the shadow of death that your poem introduced us to, and the sitting with the really hard experience that perhaps we'll only begin to see in some new kind of light months away from now. And yet actually living through that experience is also part of that, part of the resurrection as well. The resurrection is not separated from the death. Yes, yeah. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I'm conscious that the time is ticking on, but we've been reflecting very much on your personal journey and pilgrimage. You've been helping us to see how God, within the story of Holy Week at Easter, is part of our journey through pandemic. But have you any other reflections on what this journey has been like, not so much for you, or even for the church, but what about for our nations? You know, the nations of the world, but your nation and my nation, and for the world itself. You know, what has this been a spiritual journey for us, do you think, collectively, or will we just go back to being how things were?
I would hope that we are able to experience the spiritual of this moment. I think that this is a very high spiritual time in the world. I think that you know, periods of lockdown globally have moved people into spaces of quietness and solitude in ways that we have not seen before. And I think it provides spaces for reflection and connectedness in some ways that we haven't had before. I think that it was always the assumption that in order for us to connect, we must gather. And yet here we are connecting in this deeply spiritual way across the miles, and in a very personal way as well. So I think, you know, some of the questions that I'm asking, you know, are what does this mean, for example, for the ecumenical movement, right? For the ways in which we understand ourselves connected across the life of the church. Almost 10 years of my work in the United Church of Christ was as the ecumenical officer for our church. So that sense of connectedness and what it means to be church and what it means to be community, I believe that this is being redefined in this moment. And I wonder at where does the church find, and how does the church find itself in the midst of this redefining moment for this generation? So one of the things you just said, for example, you said this moment will be marked not by some of our theological treatises, but by some of the artistic ways in which this moment has been, documented. And so where's the theological reflection, I think, for this moment? How do we create the space that's needed for mourning in a time of absence? And I use absence as opposed to presence, right? So people are mourning, but they're mourning on Zoom. What does it mean, for people who are sick, mourning health issues, and attempting to apply grief to losing loved ones? So how do we understand theologically loss that is evidenced in a variety of ways, right? I think that there's theological work there. I think that there's also the pastoral work that goes along with it. Sunday mornings are different. And there's a segment of our world that is still trying to make meaning of this moment, right? So without making excuses, how do we do the theological work and the deeper spiritual work that will help communities that are broken in a multitude of ways to not just grieve and mourn, but also to be on paths of healing? Because I think that there's healing that's needed in a variety of ways, of which the pandemic becomes endemic. So the pandemic points to an illness. And how are we grieving that? How are we going to be healed from that? And I'm not talking about a vaccine, right? But I think that there is a spiritual healing that is calling us. And I think that the church needs to find itself into this moment and to maybe even helping to identify and define this moment.
Thank you. Yes, so you talk about theological work, pastoral work, spiritual work, and spiritual healing. What about the political aspects and I suppose the prophetic aspects of faith? I haven't warned you about this question, so you can ignore it if you prefer. But I'm just conscious that for those countries like yours and mine, which very much value individual freedoms, we have experienced the impact of the state in ways that have previously only really been experienced in totalitarian kind of regimes, where very strong limits are put upon our freedom to move and so on, and indeed freedom to worship. Mm-hmm. And again, in your country and mine, there are groups of people who deeply resent this, feel very unhappy with it. But there's also, I suppose, a kind of question, even if we say, well, this was for a time and it was necessary to be done out of love for our neighbor. Are there any warning signs, do you think, that we just need to be alert to about the encroaching power of the state?
Yeah, and I would actually maybe even frame that in another way, because I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on, which comes out of actually the same thing that you're talking about, is the way that this moment of social isolation begins to amplify in national ways, right? So it's the ways in which we've closed our borders to protect ourselves from the pandemic, right? And the ways in which, so it's not just, the state saying you need to stay home. It's also the state closing our borders. And I wonder at what this means for our global future when so many countries have closed their borders to protect themselves from a spreading pandemic. How do we reopen those borders? When do we reopen those borders? Is this a new way that we will experience living, where in order to protect ourselves, we actually shut out others? And I think about that personally and also globally, because I think there are larger implications to that, to even in this country, what that means around US immigration and refugee policies, for example, or US foreign policy. When we've said, well, we're closing our borders because of this thing. And now, which is kind of unique for people who live in the United States, this idea that because of the spreading pandemic here, there are a number of countries that have said that United States citizens cannot travel, right? So we're creating these kind of global boundaries, and I wonder at how do we get beyond that, and to kind of back to some of the ways in which we understood neighbor, or understood more porous borders for travel.
Yes, it's rather like the argument writ large about gated communities, really. That,
yes.
We defend ourselves so much that actually we put ourselves in a kind of prison in order to keep ourselves free. And if we're going to be starting to do that nationally, then I would see some deep worries there. No easy answers, but some really deep worries.
Yeah.
I'm just waving on time.
Okay, right.
Don't worry. I don't want to rush you because I'm enjoying this so much.
Well, I've been looking for questions coming up on our screen, but nothing has come up. I hope others are also enjoying the conversation. I really have one last question, I think, and in a way it's summing up what we've talked about, Karen Georgia. What do you think that just 2 or 3 things perhaps that we've learned from this experience that we want to take with us into our future? There's 1 or 2 things we've learned that perhaps we don't want to take forward. 1 or 2 things we've learned that we are sad about and we want to unlearn. But what are there any positives that you think we've learned that we can take forward to help shape our future?
Yes, so it's some of the things that I've pointed to earlier, right? I think that particularly now we've moved into this virtual culture. And I wonder at how do we stay connected? So this has been kind of, we've seen this kind of movement, right? We've moved into less letter writing, more emails. We send text messages to schedule phone calls. That there are these ways in which we've lost some of the connectedness around what it means to be community. And I think that this moment is calling us back to what it means to be community, what it means to actively be engaged in checking on people, to actually connect, call folks and, how are you doing? What's going on? So I think that I think it's pointing us to being more connected than we ever were, because this could fuel a further level of disconnect if we get so comfortable with these levels of isolation and a more technology guided presence. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is the spirituality for this moment. What is it that the world needs? And I would distinguish here between religion and spirituality, right? So that personal place for critical reflection, around what it means to be connected to the divine and what it then means to be connected to self and to the world. And I think that that this is such a moment. And again, now that the church has left the building, right? It creates something something new in terms of what drives our connection to spirit, because we can no longer name that primary place as going to worship on Sunday mornings or showing up for Bible study on Wednesdays. So and this is beyond Christianity. This is how people are connecting to God, understanding the divine at work, understanding their own vulnerabilities for this time and for this moment. So those are two things that certainly come to my mind. And I think that the third would be the piece that you just brought up, which is how is this then playing out globally in our countries and in our settings. My body of work in the United Church of Christ, I'm the Associate General Minister for Wider Church Ministries, and within that, I'm also the co-executive for Global Ministries, which we do with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And so keeping my eye on what's going on globally, particularly with our partners, becomes important. So as we look at what's happening particularly in countries that had communities that were already vulnerable population, what is this moment meaning for issues around hunger and poverty? Some of these larger issues that point to economic disparities that have been looming for years. And what does it mean when communities lack the ability to sustain themselves, not only economically, but as far as food is concerned, right? So how much of our food is imported? The fact that in a lot of places, people are no longer growing their own food. So the food shortages that are looming. So again, I think that there are a multiplicity of issues and places where as people of faith, but I think this is beyond a faith issue. I think it's as people of compassion, that there's something innate that drives us to care for the other. And so when I talk about being connected and not being isolated, I think that there's a global component to that is not just about your next door neighbor, but it's about how do we speak in this moment about those who might not have everything that they need. People are losing their jobs globally. They're unable to take care of their families. What is this moment calling us into? And how can we be light and salt to the earth in this moment?
Thank you. Those are very stirring and challenging words, and very helpful. Thank you. I think it's a good way to end this conversation. The global component of what you're talking about, and being salt and light. So however much we might feel that aspects of our church life have disappeared through the pandemic, what hasn't disappeared is this challenge to think globally and to transcend the local, so that we can build community across national boundaries. I love that phrase, now that the church has left the building, and I shall use that. And also the importance you talked about of mourning in absence. How do we do that? And of course, whilst we hope we will get back to mourning in presence, in one sense, many of us, if not most of us, live with the reality that we have had to mourn dearly loved ones in their absence and in absence of others to support us. Karen Georgia, thank you very much for this. I'm conscious from what you've already told us that this talking to a group of people on Zoom will have taken a lot out of you, as it takes a lot out of all of us. But you are still coming back from being very seriously ill, and so I'm extra thankful to you for that. And I know that others have been putting comments up thanking you for you making yourself vulnerable, and I do thank you for that. That's not been an easy thing, and we do very much respect your courage and willingness to do that, because I think that in itself has helped us to understand the experience of so many others over these last months. You talked about the spiritual work that needs to be done to be on paths of spiritual healing, and certainly that's my prayer, and I hope that all of us will be able to find ways of enabling that to happen. But I'm sure that everyone who's been part of this webinar would join me in trusting that you yourself will find physical as well as spiritual healing, you and your family and any others you know, as you move forward, hopefully, towards a COVID-free world. Thank you very much. Thank you to others who've been with us very much, and to some of the lovely comments that have come up on our feed. And I'll hand over now to Helen to draw us to an end.
And while Helen is coming, the poem, there was a question in the chat about the poem. The poem will be made available on the Just Festival website, as I understand it. And thank you all for the comments. Robin, Robert, Brooke, Joyce, and so many friends that I see who have joined. Thank you all for being present. And thank you, John and Helen and Grant, again, for your hospitality.
Thank you, Karen Georgia.
Well, I think that's been one of the most powerful conversations that we've had in the festival so far. And so on behalf of Just Festival, I really just want to thank you for that. Karen Georgia, for your generosity and openness in your sharing. And we also do hope you and your family fully recover and feel back to full health very soon. And thank you, John, for hosting. And so I think we'll take some guidance from Karen Georgia's poem and just sit with the conversation and the images that you've shared. Karen Georgia, I can't forget the image of men in hazmat suits. That might, thinking of that image in your mind of your father's funeral, I think it's brutal, and it must be very, very hard to carry that image. So now we'll close this event, and thank you all for attending, and have a very good rest of your evening. Good night.